Hello everyone. Welcome to AMH 2020, U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877. This is the second video in my series on um, the U.S. involvement in World War II, and this video is going to be focused primarily on a military history of America in the Second World War. And I'm going to try to talk about things that don't often get discussed in textbooks and general surveys of World War II. And again, this is a survey video. There's a lot of things that we just won't have time to go over. We're primarily going to be talking about the main U.S. military operations during the war. I'm not going to be talking as much about the Eastern Front in World War II, where the Soviet Union is fighting against Nazi Germany. I'm not going to be talking as much about the war in the Asian mainland, in China and in Indochina and in Southeast Asia. I'm also going to be focusing on what's going on in the Pacific, where the U.S. is most active. That doesn't mean that the U.S. does not have an impact on the fighting in those other regions. We are having an impact in Asia and in Eastern Europe via the Lend-Lease program, but I'm mostly going to be talking about U.S. operational military efforts or operational military history. And operational military history is different than war and society military history, which is a more holistic perspective that talks about domestic mobilization and the home front. What I did in the last video on this subject. This video will be much more focused on battles, tactics, technology, and the strategies used by U.S. military leaders. And then we will wrap up this two-video series on World War II by talking about the effects that the war has on the United States and the United States' place in the war. And one last thing to note, I'm going to be talking about the Pacific Theater first, because the major fighting for the U.S., Marine Corps, Navy, and Army, it's going to be in the Pacific. Even though actually the United States put more of an emphasis on fighting in Europe than it did in the Pacific. I'm going to talk about the Pacific first, because generally speaking, the textbooks and sources I've consulted, they tend to talk about Europe first. So I want to do things a little bit differently. And now we'll talk about the U.S. War effort in the Pacific. To begin, the United States really struggles in the Pacific, through about the first half of 1942. Things do not look good for the U.S. or for the Allies in the Pacific. And I want to say that I'm going to primarily be talking about the Pacific Ocean, the island operations in the Pacific. I'm not going to be talking as much about U.S. operations in China and in other parts of the East Asian mainland. This is a survey course. You could easily do entire courses just on World War II. But in early 1942, the Japanese Army and Navy, they seized the Philippines in the spring of 42. They seized the Dutch East Indies with its oil resources. They've seized parts of the Solomon Islands, and they've also taken over Guam and Wake Island, and they appear to be poised for an invasion of Australia. They have established a presence on New Guinea as well, and it's really a very dire situation for the U.S. and an even worse situation for Australia. Most of the Australian military has been deployed in the Middle East, assisting the British Empire, and many in the Australian government have actually adopted, by this point, a very fatalistic attitude. They were prepared to actually lose about 3/4 of the Australian mainland to the Japanese, and they were just going to try to defend the southeastern portion of Australia, where its largest population centers are. Brisbane up in Queensland, all the way down to Sydney, further to the south. Douglas MacArthur, he retreated to Australia. He thought this was a bad idea. He thought that the Japanese must not be allowed to gain a foothold in Australia. Australia had immense natural resources that the United States and Australia needed. We did not want to fall into Japanese hands. So MacArthur believed the best thing that the U.S. and what was left of the Australian military could do was to actually strike back at the Japanese and push the Japanese out of New Guinea and then work northward towards the Philippines. There was also a personal element here as well. MacArthur wanted to liberate the Philippines after being defeated there. He wanted to keep good on his promise to return. And MacArthur is going to be the commander of U.S. Army operations in the Pacific. But before MacArthur and the Army can beat back the Japanese in New Guinea, they've got to engage the Japanese Navy. And they're going to do that at the Battle of Coral Sea. This battle was fought from May 4th through 8th, 1942. It's considered to be a very significant engagement in global naval history, as this battle is primarily fought by aircraft carriers. It's primarily Japanese aircraft launching from Japanese carriers, attacking American aircraft launched from American carriers. And both fleets are out of sight of each other. They're far enough away that they can't see each other and launch artillery at each other. It's going to be the aircraft from both of these planes fighting each other. This was something that Billy Mitchell back in the 1920s for the United States was saying this was the future of naval warfare. Air power was going to be dominant in ground-based, land-based warfare, and in the naval warfare as well. Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Japanese. They won the battle, you might say, because they did more damage to the U.S. Navy than was inflicted on them. The U.S. Lost a large carrier, the USS Lexington. American carriers were generally larger than Japanese carriers, and the carriers of other nations as well. And they lose a destroyer too. And Japan lost a smaller carrier. But this was a tactical victory, but it's also what we would call a Pyrrhic victory in naval history. And Pyrrhic victories are, it's a reference to an ancient Greek general named Pyrrhus. He would fight the Romans, and he would win battles, but he would use too many resources, ultimately contributing to his defeat. And this is exactly what happens. The Japanese may have won this tactical battle, but then they strategically are going to lose because they're losing resources. The Japanese are in very dire straits when it comes to resources, even by 1942. And the United States, however, our economy gets stronger and stronger each month, hitting its peak in 1944. We can much better replace the aircraft carriers we lose than the Japanese ever will be able to. So ultimately, Coral Sea is going to be a strategic win for the U.S. because it's bleeding the Japanese dry. Before we continue our discussion of the Battle of Coral Sea, I just want to make a note about the United States' alliances in the Pacific. We had alliances with Australia and with the British Empire as a whole. We also made alliances with indigenous peoples on some of the islands that we established military bases. And you see this in certain Melanesian islands, like Tanna, for example. The island of Tanna, the local Melanesian people, they have established what are called cargo cults. And you see them on other islands as well, where they basically worship figures that are inspired by the U.S. military presence during World War II. And what happened was during the war, the U.S. military would set up airfields, and they would bring in food supplies and cargo, and they would trade with the local indigenous populations. And these populations, which had minimal contact with the outside world and with modern technology like aircraft, they assumed that the U.S. had supernatural power and that they were almost godlike, and that if the people of these islands performed certain rituals and made their own aircraft and landing strips, the United States would return because the United States left after the war, and that there would be a new era of prosperity, and it would be like the end of the world, but in a good way. In particular, the people of Tanna, they actually worshipped a deity called Tom Navy that was based on the U.S. troops that were deployed in their islands during the war. So this is where the term cargo cult comes from, which you may have heard from before. It's basically if someone is said to be in a cargo cult, either they're directly referencing these religious movements in the Pacific, or they're referring to someone who has reverence for an old tradition that they are trying to recreate but don't fully understand. But now I'm going to continue discussing the war in the Pacific, specifically the Battle of Coral Sea. This is a battle map of the Battle of the Coral Sea. You can see the Solomon Islands here, and you also see New Guinea here, especially Port Moresby. Technically, this is Papua New Guinea, but um, the Japanese have important bases at Rabaul here, and New Guinea is an area that they are advancing into. But in order to retake the Philippines and to really protect Australia, we need to liberate New Guinea, and we need to maintain control of the Solomon Islands, which the Japanese are operating on both of these island groups. So the Japanese aircraft and the American aircraft engage each other. The U.S. Lexington is going to be sunk. The Japanese will also lose a carrier of their own. And the USS Yorktown is going to be damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea. It will have to retreat. Eventually, it's going to be repaired and refitted, and it will be used at the Battle of Midway. But the Japanese, they cannot repair and replace the vessels they lose in the way that the United States can. So this does contribute to their running out of resources and ultimately losing in the War of the Pacific. And now we'll talk about the Battle of Midway, and it's considered to be a turning point in the naval aspect of the Pacific War. In the Naval Pacific War, you have the U.S. Army, controlled by General Douglas MacArthur, and the U.S. Navy, which includes the Marine Corps, controlled by Admiral Chester Nimitz. And both parties have to work together. On the whole, though, the United States operates in a more unilateral fashion. It's the U.S.'s show, with Australia and New Zealand supporting us, with the British supporting us to a lesser degree as well. But the U.S. is calling the shots in a way that is not quite as possible in Europe. The United States is the supreme allied commander in Europe is Dwight Eisenhower, but we have to negotiate and collaborate more with other allied leaders in a way that we don't have to in the Pacific. Things are more unilateral in the Pacific, whereas they're more multilateral in Europe. And also, part of that unilateralism versus multilateralism, the United States took a Europe first strategy. About 80 to 90% of our supply efforts and our human resources went towards the fighting in Europe, whereas only about 10 to 20% of our resources went to fighting in the Pacific. And people like Douglas MacArthur, who fought in the Pacific and who also, had his own perspectives and opinions, he said that the United States was basically contributing net zero to the Pacific War because we were getting a lot of resources from Australia. And that basically, because of the resources we got from Australia, the United States was hardly putting anything into the war in the Pacific in terms of net input. We were getting more out of it than we were putting in, is what MacArthur argued anyway. But at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, U.S. intelligence had intercepted the Japanese battle plans, and we actually will begin to break the Japanese coding system, the water transport system it was called. So we had access to their battle plans, and Admiral Nimitz is going to use this information to really soundly defeat the Japanese, to sink 4 of their aircraft carriers, whereas we only lose 1 carrier. And Japan had to attack at Midway with a smaller fleet because 2 of their carriers were either damaged or sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea. So the Japanese were already short on resources going into this battle, and then the U.S. has intercepted their battle plans and is decoding their communications systems. And this victory is considered to be a turning point in the Naval Pacific War, because after this point, the Japanese are no longer advancing in the Pacific. They're going to be retreating and falling back towards the Japanese home islands. But there's still a lot of hard fighting ahead. And it's going to set up the Allied war effort for the next phase in the war in the Pacific, and that is island hopping. This is a battle map of the Battle of Midway. As you can see from this map, the USS Yorktown was sunk. What basically happened is the Japanese planes were bombing Midway Island, and the American aircraft, they don't stop the attack on Midway Island, but they're able to attack the Japanese carriers while the Japanese aircraft are away, or while they're on the deck and refueling. So the carriers were in a very vulnerable position. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4 are going to be sunk, whereas the U.S., of course, only loses one carrier. And here is Admiral Chester Nimitz. And this battle was revenge for Pearl Harbor. Here's a bit more of an explanation of island hopping. This is a strategy of coordinated U.S. naval, air, and land-based or ground forces to retake islands that the Japanese had captured and roll back the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. Not completely roll them back, but roll them back partially in order to prepare for bombing raids on the Japanese home islands. The United States wanted to establish island bases for bombing Japanese cities. This was a very difficult thing to do because of the distance between the United States and Japan. The United States had tried to launch bombing raids from China. This was called Operation Matterhorn. We'd also had things like the Doolittle raid in early 1942, in which James Doolittle led B-25 bombing raids against Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Then they landed their aircraft in China. That was more of a symbolic gesture, strike back at the Japanese after they attacked Pearl Harbor. We needed to have island bases if we're really going to damage the Japanese cities and the Japanese industrial base. And part of island hopping involves what is called leapfrogging. And you'll skip over islands, bypass islands that either don't have strategic importance or that are too powerful. The Japanese garrisons are too powerful and too well dug in. And then these uncaptured islands, they can be isolated from Japanese reinforcement. And basically, they will either starve to death or forced to surrender. You see this with islands like Rabaul off the coast of New Guinea. This island was strongly defended by the Japanese, and it was used by the Japanese, but it was not worth spilling American blood and wasting American treasure. You also have the Truk Atoll in Micronesia. This was an important Japanese naval base. It was too well defended. It was better to fight the Japanese Navy piecemeal away from their base at Truk. And airfields will be built on liberated islands. Planes can be launched to help the Allies gain air superiority in the Pacific, and then to move on and capture new islands. And improvements to aircraft technology and air ordnance are going to allow the United States to establish air superiority for the Allies in the Pacific. Technologies like the P-38, made by Lockheed, they'll be launched from land-based airfields. Technology like the Hellcat by Grumman, it's a carrier-based plane. These aircraft are going to go toe-to-toe against the Japanese Zero. Particularly the Hellcat was designed specifically to go against the Zero. And this is going to help the United States maintain and establish air superiority. Because the side that has air superiority is the side that's going to win World War II. It's true in the Pacific and it's true in Europe. In ground-based, land-based warfare, the United States is going to fight at Guadalcanal and Tarawa in the Solomon Islands from August of 1942 to November of 1943. And these are hard battles for the United States. The U.S. Marine Corps and Army, they have supply issues. They are relatively inexperienced, but they're going to defeat the Japanese using overwhelming force and gain very important combat experience. And the fighting on land is not going to be an easy, bloodless sideshow to the naval and air operations in the Pacific. Some people in World War II hoped that air fighting, air power would make land-based fighting, boots on the ground, unnecessary. That definitely was not the case. Here is a map of U.S. Operations in the Pacific. Operations in the Western Pacific were handled primarily by MacArthur and by the Army, with some coordination with the Navy, most notably Admiral William Halsey. But Operations in the Central Pacific on these smaller islands and atolls, these were handled more by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps. And these are scenes from the Guadalcanal campaign. The initial amphibious assault by the Marines was also protected by the U.S. Coast Guard. In this event, signalman First Class Douglas Monroe, he offered covering fire for the Marines as they were deploying, and he was killed in action. He received the Medal of Honor. To this point, he's the only U.S. Coast Guard member who has received the Medal of Honor. Here are some scenes from the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese forces fought with a lot of determination, using shock and awe tactics, banzai charges, very aggressive tactics to try to um, knock back the United States. The Japanese troops have been told that they were fighting the U.S. Marines, who were the most crazy and dangerous members of the U.S. military, that they were prisoners and convicts and people taken out of mental hospitals, and so they fought with a lot of ferocity, and they did not show very much kindness to prisoners that they took. In some cases, they even mutilated the bodies of American troops, and this angered and incensed American troops who said that, yeah, after seeing what the Japanese did to the bodies of our friends and comrades, we didn't take a whole lot of Japanese prisoners, even though the Japanese rarely surrendered and became prisoners of war anyway, due to the Bushido Code. But the fighting was very difficult in Guadalcanal. It was jungle warfare. There was a lot of rains and flooding and tropical diseases. There were problems getting food and supplies to the American troops. But in the end, the United States, with its overwhelming resources, is able to defeat the Japanese by the fall of 1943 at Guadalcanal and in the Solomon Islands. After the United States' costly successes in the Solomon Islands, the U.S. military is going to focus its efforts on retaking the Central Pacific Marshall Islands from November of 43 to February of 44. Um, the idea is use the Central Pacific Marshall Islands as a base of operations to continue rolling back the Japanese Empire and to capture the Mariana Islands, including the liberation of Guam. And that's going to happen later. That's going to be in June through November of 1944. At about the same time, in the summer through fall of 1944, you also have operations in the Palau Islands, including Peleliu. This is part of the liberation of the Philippines. The U.S. Navy and naval aircraft, they're going to win a major victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th through 20th, 1944. Really, the back of the Japanese Navy is going to be broken. They're not going to have the ability to engage U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships, etc., nearly as easily after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Also, at the Battle of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It's also called the Mariana Turkey Shoot because of the large number of Japanese aircraft of Zeros that are shot down, particularly because the United States is gaining air superiority, technological air superiority in the Pacific. Well, the Zero was a very good plane. It was expensive and difficult to maintain. Its resources that the Japanese simply just don't have anymore. Meanwhile, the United States is building, aircraft like the Hellcat, which is designed specifically to hunt down the Zero, and it's called the Mariana Turkey Shoot because of comparatively, how easily the United States' aircraft are taking out the Japanese. The Japanese lost over 400 aircraft at the Mariana Turkey Shoot, whereas the United States lost just over 120. And in the fighting at the Marshall Islands, which includes the battles at Saipan and Tinian, the United States had perfected its amphibious assaults, and it really had come to recognize the importance of overwhelming force and in integrating your ground-based and your air and your naval forces. Use your battleships to shell Japanese islands. Use your aircraft to keep their planes out of the sky and to bomb Japanese targets, and then make really well coordinated amphibious assaults. This was especially well done at the Battle of Tinian. Basically, the U.S. military made a feint. They tricked the Japanese, made them think they were going to land on one side of the island, then they attacked the other side of the island. And the Marshall Islands eventually are going to be important bases for attacks on Japanese soil using the B-29 bomber. And they also are going to be a staging ground for the liberation of Guam and of the Mariana Islands. Things are going to be more challenging, though, in the Palau Islands, especially at the Battle of Peleliu, September through November of 1944. And the Battle of Peleliu is seen as being significant because by this point, the Japanese know not only can they not win the war, they don't have the resources to be as aggressive with the United States anymore. What they, instead of using their shock and awe and aggressive tactics that they used at Guadalcanal and earlier in the war, now they're going to use what is called a cave and bunker strategy. In the cave and bunker strategy, they're going to make the Americans come to them, and they're going to try to kill as many Americans as they can and try to basically wear down the resolve of the United States to try to salvage some kind of peace. It's not going to be an absolute and total defeat for Japan. So it's a much more a strategy of attrition, of just trying to tire out the United States and take away our ability to keep fighting. And it actually sort of works at the Battle of Peleliu. There's going to be isolated pockets of Japanese resistance as late as early 1945 at Peleliu, but people argue about military historians argue that the Palau campaign and then even the liberation of the Philippines may not have been as tactically necessary for the American victory. It was an important prestige objective. It was about MacArthur redeeming himself and about helping the Americans and the Filipinos who were being mistreated by the Japanese, but retaking the Philippines may not have been as necessary for defeating Japan. It was a good thing. These islands needed to be retaken, but it may not have been an absolute necessity. There is one very good thing, though, for the overall Pacific War effort that comes out of the Philippine liberation. That is the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. Basically, what happened is almost the entirety of the rest of the Japanese Navy is going to be destroyed. This is going to give the U.S. Navy almost carte blanche after Leyte Gulf to liberate the Philippines and to continue striking at Japan. Still, though, even without naval support, there was a lot of very hard fighting in the Philippines, particularly in Manila. There were tens of thousands of Filipino civilians that were killed who were basically used as human shields by the Japanese. And the Philippines are going to be retaken starting in October of 1944. They're going to be retaken by early 1945. But again, some would argue that while the retaking of the Philippines was important for morale and important for Douglas MacArthur's career and important for helping the people of the Philippines, both Americans and Filipinos, some would argue that it wasn't really essential to defeating Japan. Here are some images about the fighting in the Central Pacific, in the Marshalls, in the Marianas, and in the Palau campaign, specifically Peleliu. These islands were important because they're going to be B-29 bases, but the fighting, particularly at the Palau Islands, some people argue how tactically important it was. And certainly the fighting at Peleliu was brutal. The Japanese developed their new cave and bunker strategy, but it really just wore out and exhausted the American forces that fought there. You have things like the 1,000-yard stare amongst American troops that have been deployed and who have been on the front for too long and have not been rotated to the back for proper R&R. What happens in World War II, and this is different than other wars that America fought in, is there are large parts of the Army and the Marine Corps and the Navy that are in non-combat positions. Really, it's the majority of troops. And then the combat is handled by the infantry and some other units who don't get very much relief. And people get what is called combat fatigue. And combat fatigue in World War II, it's a little bit like shell shock in World War I. Some might call it a form of post-traumatic stress disorder today, where the soldiers, the Marines, they get so exhausted, they almost don't care if they live or die anymore. And you even see some troops engaging in risky behaviors almost as if they're trying to commit suicide and not really caring if they're alive or if they're going to be killed by the enemy. You start to see this combat fatigue amongst troops at places like Peleliu. And it's because of troops not being rested and rotated away from the front, and because of too much of the combat responsibility falling on just infantry units. And some of these infantry units would have a 90% casualty rate. Meanwhile, other units that were not involved in direct combat had a much lower casualty rate. In the Pacific War, based on my research and my estimates, um, soldiers, Marines, sailors had about a 1 in 7 to a 1 in 5% chance. A 1 in 5 to 1 in 7, meaning like 20% chance of becoming a casualty, either being killed or wounded. But when you look at infantry and combat units, the chance of being killed or wounded is much, much, much higher, disproportionately higher. It skews the results as opposed to the non-combat units. And that's going to contribute to things like combat fatigue. And in previous wars like the Civil War, the most courageous soldiers were those that fearlessly charged at the enemy, and they were seen as courageous if they were still reckless. But in World War II, that was not the case. That was not seen as courageous. American military officers like Dwight Eisenhower, who he was in Europe, not the Pacific, he said courage was not blindly charging at the enemy in World War II. He said courage was following orders and staying alive and just having endurance. That was the bravest thing an American soldier or Marine could do, was staying alive, fight for another day. And you definitely see this as combat fatigue becomes more of a problem in World War II. But um, on the far right-hand side of the slide, you see the B-29 bomber, an essential aircraft to be used for the strategic bombing of Japan. These long-range bombers were critical to the American grand strategy in the Pacific. They're not quite as necessary in the European war, where these bombing raids are not covering as long of distances. But hard fighting in these islands, bodies would not be properly buried. American troops used to say they'd give directions based on there's a skeleton over there, make a right. There's a body over there that we can't bury because of a Japanese sniper, make a left. Really, this is how people cope with these traumatic and stressful situations. On the left is the Grumman Hellcat, a carrier-based fighter that was designed specifically to go after the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero. And on the right is the Lockheed P-38, sometimes known as the Lightning. And this craft was launched from airfields and had a longer range. And it was designed to be a multi-purpose plane. It could be used as a fighter bomber. It could be used as an escort aircraft. And it had 2 engines, whereas the Hellcat only had 1. And these 2 airplanes, along with the B-29, they're going to play an essential role in defeating the Japanese Air Force and in establishing air superiority in the Pacific. And this is a Mitsubishi Zero. And this aircraft, while very fast and very capable, and the height of technology at the beginning of the war, it became obsolete thanks in part to the Hellcat, which was designed specifically to hunt down the Zero. Also, the Japanese had a hard time making sure they had enough fuel for their aircraft, and the Zero was very hard to work on as well. Its fuselage and its wings were all one piece, which made it much more difficult to repair and to keep it in the skies. So, while it may have been a very impressive aircraft in terms of capability, um, they had supply issues and they had repair issues, and ultimately they're going to be defeated by the United States, especially by the Hellcat, and they're going to be defeated at battles like the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. This is the U.S. Amphibious operations to liberate the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur making good on his promise to return. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in which the Japanese Navy was badly damaged and almost completely destroyed, was actually 4 smaller engagements, and there were aircraft battles, destroyer battles, or even battleship battles. Really, by some estimates, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in world history, And it was the last engagement in which battleships fought each other alongside aircraft carriers and alongside destroyers. Naval warfare is going to change significantly after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The age of the battleship is definitely over after Leyte Gulf, as Japanese battleships are sunk, and you're going to see that naval warfare post World War II is going to be much more spread out across the world rather than in single pitched battles. Submarines also played an essential role in the U.S. military's achievement of naval superiority in the Pacific. Submarines at the beginning of World War II have been a challenge for the United States, but improvements to torpedo technology and to sonar allowed the United States to use submarines much more effectively in the Pacific. Subs were used for a variety of missions, but I would argue their two most important missions were attacking Japanese merchant marine shipping, the vessels that brought supplies into the Japanese home islands, essentially slowly but surely starving the Japanese war effort of food and supplies. And then their other very important mission was they could be used to rescue downed fighter pilots and downed bomber pilots that their aircraft had been shot down and they had to eject from their aircraft. So they play a major role in the U.S. victory in the Pacific, and service on submarines was cramped, very dangerous, as you can see from the image at left. But the pay was better, and there was a level of prestige that came from serving on a submarine. Military regulations and things were relaxed a bit because you're in tight quarters underwater. And to be a submariner in the Pacific in World War II, you were playing a big part in the war effort. And there was a level of prestige that came with the danger of serving underwater in this capacity. After the Philippines were retaken, which, as I've said, some people debate how important it was that the U.S. retakes the Philippines, the U.S. is going to continue to close in on the Japanese home islands. We're capturing strategic isles and atolls, rolling back the Japanese empire and island hopping in the central and really we're getting into the northern Pacific now. And the U.S. Marine Corps is going to capture the heavily defended small volcanic isle of Iwo Jima in February of 1945. Iwo Jima, while small, it was a very important island because we needed a place to land damaged B-29 bombers that had been damaged during their bombing sorties over the Japanese home islands. And again, the Japanese know that they cannot defeat the U.S. military. They cannot defeat the Marines. So what they're going to do is try to wear us down with their cave and bunker strategy and inflict as many casualties as possible. The Japanese defenders, they were probably no more than 20,000 or 21,000. Um, they're going to fight a U.S. Marine force of about 110,000, and they're going to inflict about 25,000 casualties, out of which 6,000 are going to be deaths. It's going to be a really brutal battle on the Isle of Iwo Jima. And at the end of the battle, when the smoke clears, fewer than 300 Japanese are going to be captured at the end of the battle. The vast majority of them either are killed in battle or they will die in suicides or in suicidal attacks, as they're really trying to score as many American casualties as possible using the cave and bunker strategy. And this is the island of Iwo Jima. It's a small volcanic island covered in this grayish black soil. They used to say it looked a little bit like a burnt steak or a burnt pork chop. But at the southern edge of the island is Mount Suribachi. This is where the famous raising of the U.S. flag took place, iconic image in American history and in military history. But very hard fighting here, as I said. Almost the entire Japanese force was killed, and only about 300 were left alive to surrender to the United States. But this was a critical base for landing damaged B-29 bombers. I want to talk a bit more about overall grand strategy amongst the U.S. military and amongst the Japanese military in World War II. The Japanese were very tenacious soldiers, very disciplined. The Bushido Code was part of the Japanese military culture, but there were problems with the Bushido Code that I think really damaged the Japanese war effort long term. Its emphasis on fighting to the death and even committing suicide rather than facing retreat and dishonor. I think it really hurt the Japanese command structure. Their most capable officers, their most capable pilots were not surviving combat. They were either committing suicide or engaging in suicidal attacks that led the Japanese to lose some of their best, smartest, most capable troops. You really see this with Zero pilots as well. And that's going to really be a problem for a country that has much more limited human resources than the United States, and that really has been fighting since 1931. By Pearl Harbor in 41, Japan has been fighting for a decade in China, which people often forget that the Japanese are still fighting in China, even as they're fighting against the United States in the Pacific. And the Japanese were facing immense supply shortages that affected the equipment that they supplied to their troops. But actually, the Japanese soldiers were very efficiently supplied for, considering the limited resources Japan had. It's estimated that the Japanese army was very efficient. For every combat soldier, there was only one non-combat soldier, supplying the troops, engaging in construction projects, guard duty. The U.S. Army, however, was not the case. That was not the case at all. There are estimates that for every combat soldier or Marine in the U.S. military, there were as many as 16 non-combat and support personnel, backing them up, launching artillery strikes, doing construction work like Seabees for the Navy. The U.S. Army was not nearly as efficient, but that was actually okay. We could afford to do that. And really, the decision by the United States was, we're going to spend more money. We're going to give our troops the best supplies that we possibly can, and that's going to save lives. We're going to trade money for lives, essentially, which is not really how the Japanese saw things. One, the Bushido Code did not work that way. It was about dying in battle. And two, the Japanese just didn't have the resources. They had to do things in a much more stripped down manner. And this image shows U.S. Marines and U.S. Army soldiers facing off against Japanese troops. Japanese troops carried the Arisaka bolt-action rifle. Eventually, they were really, really cutting corners on this rifle. And the United States, they were arming their troops. Over time, they began to arm them with M1 Garand 8-shot rifles and the M1 carbine. Here you see a soldier using a M1 Garand and a Marine using an M1 carbine. The carbine being a much smaller caliber weapon. It's actually a myth, though, that the Japanese would charge the American troops when they heard the Garand magazine get expelled. It comes out through the top of the rifle, and it makes a very distinctive pinging noise. Really, what they were doing was just a more aggressive strategy early in the war to try to frighten and cause the United States troops to retreat. It wasn't because they were charging when they heard the Garand expel its cartridge, its magazine. It's just one of those many myths we have about World War II that comes around as a result of media about the war. Iwo Jima has been captured, the Philippines have been liberated, and the U.S. Military is preparing for a coordinated attack with Army, Navy, and Marines on Okinawa. Okinawa is much closer to Japan. It's not considered to be part of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese regard the Okinawans as a different group, different than the Yamato Japanese people, and really inferior to the Japanese people. But Okinawa is much more densely populated than the small atolls and island chains we've been fighting in, and many people will regard it as kind of a taste of what fighting is going to be like in the Japanese home islands. We're going to fight for over 2 months in the spring and into the summer of 1945. During the Okinawa campaign, the war will actually end in Europe. And during the Okinawa campaign, there's going to be thousands of U.S. casualties. It's during the Okinawa campaign that you see the large-scale use of kamikaze pilots for the first time. Uh, Japanese troops did engage in suicidal attacks before this, but now it's going to be a official Japanese military policy. Kamikaze means divine wind. Um, the Japanese pilots that engage in the kamikaze attacks, they believe that they are sacrificing their lives for honor and for their country and for the emperor. Initially, the first kamikaze pilots were volunteers, but as time goes on, as the most zealous, the most nationalistic, the most patriotic pilots are killed in these attacks, we start to see a lot more pilots being pressured and, in some cases, you might say, forced into making these suicidal attacks using their aircraft. And the reason they're doing that is because um, the Zero has been outpaced by American aircraft like the Hellcat. It can't compete with the Hellcats. In addition, they don't have the fuel and the munitions to, run conventional strafing runs and attacks. Instead, they're basically going to turn these planes into human-guided missiles. Also, the Japanese, because of the Bushido strategy, they've lost a lot of their best pilots at the Mariana Turkey Shoot and in other battles. These are more what we would call novice, inexperienced pilots who they know enough to crash a plane, but they don't know how to dogfight because they don't have the resources and the time to get the training they need to be really good pilots. They're good enough to fly a plane and to crash it, but they're not good enough to take out Hellcats. But these kamikaze attacks are very effective against American aircraft carriers. You hit the carrier, you take out its runway, and it can't launch more planes. You take out destroyers that have a hard time shooting down a plane that's going to careen into them. It's really brutal fighting, and it's a little bit of that myth of Japanese invincibility comes out again. We see how zealous the Japanese are, even committing in these suicidal kamikaze attacks. And then on the island itself, the fighting is really brutal. It's not a good place to be on offense. You're dealing with really awful spring rains, bogging down American, tanks, and really, really hard fighting. And the Japanese will, in some cases, use the Okinawan citizens as human shields. Um, Something that would not have been able to be done in the less populated parts of the Pacific. You have very high civilian casualties in Okinawa in general. People dying from as a result of the U.S. military operations as well. And people begin to question: is this what the fighting in Japan is going to be like? And the image on this slide, it might look kind of humorous, but some U.S. Marines from South Carolina, they initially hoisted a Confederate flag over the Japanese headquarters at Shuri Castle. This is in spring in May of 1945. They were doing this not because they were taking the castle for the Confederacy, but they were doing it, they said, to honor their commanding officer, who was a Southerner and who had been wounded in the assault. It's mentioned by other eyewitnesses, Marines that were there, like Ernie Pyle and Eugene Sledge, who was actually from Alabama. He was a Southerner, which I highly recommend reading Sledge's memoir about his service. It's called With the Old Breed. It's about his fighting in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. It's a great read. But at this point in American history, a lot of Southerners, their interest in the Confederacy, even in the Lost Cause, really had come to be conflated and mixed with American nationalism and patriotism. It might seem odd that former enemies of the United States have been mixed in with U.S. history, but that was a common sentiment in the 1940s and the 1950s. And they did eventually replace the Confederate flag with a American flag at Shuri Castle. And here is a battle map of the Okinawa campaign. The fighting actually starts in the northern parts of the island, and the U.S. works its way south. But there's fighting in April and May and June of 1945. And during this period, the war in Europe ends, and things are going to change in the Pacific because of the end of the war in Europe. While the fighting rages on in the Pacific, the big three, the leaders of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, gather in Potsdam, Germany, to discuss the Pacific War and the ending of the war in Europe and the post-war order. They talk about the 5 Ds for Germany: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and then decentralization and deindustrialization of their economy to prevent Germany from ever rising up again. Now, these ideas are going to change with time. The idea of what to do with post-war Germany is going to change with time. Germany will be divided into occupation zones, and reparations will be collected for the victorious Allies. And plans for peace with Nazi Germany's former allies, countries like Romania, for example, which were on the Axis side, those are discussed as well. And new borders for Poland are going to be established. This will unfortunately involve the forced relocation, you might even say the ethnic cleansing of Germans who live in what had once been East Prussia, but it's going to be given to Poland. And the territory had been part of Prussia for hundreds of years, but it had been Polish even before that. So these are people who are being taken from their ancestral homes, you might say, and sent to Germany. That way, that territory can be Polish for the Polish people, who have also suffered greatly and who also have had their country taken from them multiple times. This was something in particular that Stalin wanted. Now, Stalin wanted to set up a communist puppet government in Poland, so he had his own self-serving reasons for wanting there to be a large Polish nation state as well. But at the Potsdam Conference, a Potsdam Declaration is issued. It's issued towards Japan that if it does not surrender, it will face utter destruction, because the Soviet Union, which had been neutral, is now going to declare war on Japan. They're going to declare war on Japan within 3 months of the ending of the fighting in Europe. And the leaders we're talking about here, Joseph Stalin, President Harry S. Truman, who replaces FDR, who had died earlier in 1945, and then the British have a leadership change during the conference. Prime Minister Winston Churchill is voted out, and he's replaced by Clement Attlee, who, politically speaking, was more liberal than Churchill was and had a lot less political and foreign policy experience. He ends up being a much more minimal member of the Big Three than Churchill was. Also, it should be noted, too, that Truman had a much more adversarial relationship with Stalin than FDR did. FDR was very charitable to Stalin. He wanted to make sure that Stalin was happy and stayed in the coalition. But Truman, you might actually say, had a better understanding of Stalin and had a more, knew what kind of guy he was and wanted to stand up to him more. So there's more tension between the Western Allies and between the Soviets at the Potsdam Conference. And not only do the Allies want Japan to surrender, they want Japan to surrender unconditionally. Japan is trying to work out a negotiated peace, a very strong negotiated peace that will include things like the emperor will be allowed to maintain his position in the government because he's essentially a divine figure for the Japanese people, and the Japanese military leaders like Tojo, they will not be tried by an international court like in the Nuremberg trials. They will be tried by Japanese courts, where they'll be more likely to be acquitted by a Japanese jury. And they also want no occupation of the Japanese home islands. But that's not what the Western Allies want. They really want to defeat Japan, and they want Japan to know that it has been defeated via an occupation and via a dissolution of the military government. And then they want accountability for the Japanese military leadership. The one area where the Western Allies were willing to negotiate was on allowing the emperor to remain in power. But the Japanese may not have understood this. They didn't understand that perhaps the United States' unconditional surrender was not truly unconditional. They might be willing to bend on letting the emperor maintain control. Either way, though, the war does not end with the Potsdam Declaration. On July 26, 1945, we issue a call for a Japanese surrender, which will include an occupation of the Japanese home islands, which would be considered shameful and dishonorable to the Japanese, but the Allies view it as a necessity to ensure that Japan is fully defeated and that they accept their defeat in the war. but there have been very high losses for the Army, the Navy, and the Marines at Okinawa, and many in the American High Command are convinced that a ground invasion of the Japanese mainland, which was supposed to begin in November of 1945, that it will simply be too bloody and too costly, that possibly as many as 1 million Americans might be killed or become casualties in that invasion and occupation of Japan, and then millions more Japanese might die in this assault on the Japanese home islands. So you have things like the strategic bombing of Japanese cities, which has been going on for months at this point. The United States has established bases across the Pacific. B-29 bombers are running bombing raids on Japanese cities like Tokyo and Kyoto. And instead of using explosive ordnance, they're using primarily incendiary bombs on Japanese cities. Japanese construction was different than the type of construction that was done in European cities. They basically were burning these cities to the ground using their fire bombs, which is a little bit different than the strategic bombing that was taking place in Europe. But hundreds of thousands of Japanese are going to be killed in these fire bombings. But that's not the end of the bombings. The United States will drop bombs, atomic bombs, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August the 6th and August the 9th, 1945. In between these bombings, the Soviet Union will officially declare war on Japan. Japan had actually been trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Soviets as they were coming into the war. Those negotiations don't go anywhere. But the mass resistance on Okinawa, the anticipated mass resistance in the Japanese home islands, pressure that the Soviets are now entering the war and relations with the Soviets are already declining. It leads President Truman to make the difficult decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States have been experimenting with atomic technology since at least 1939. Scientists at the University of Chicago split the atom in that period. But American scientists and then a lot of actually German scientists, German refugee scientists, some of whom were Jewish, came to the United States. They experimented with the bombs. People like Albert Einstein, for example, J. Robert Oppenheimer worked on the bombs as well. They tested the bombs in the desert Southwest. Robert Oppenheimer famously declared, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." He begged President Truman not to use these bombs that he had helped to create on the Japanese. And Truman was apparently very annoyed with Oppenheimer's appeals. Apparently, he said, "Get this crybaby out of my sight," after Oppenheimer tried to appeal to him. That was just Truman's sense of style. And people question if FDR had been alive, would he have dropped those bombs? And I think almost certainly he would have. The bomb research was begun during FDR's presidency. And President Truman actually didn't know about the bombs until after FDR passed away. That's how secretly protected America's nuclear bomb program, the Manhattan Project, was. But Truman made the decision to drop the bombs. And Truman became president in April of 1945 after FDR died in office. FDR served 4 terms as president, or three whole terms in the beginning of the 4th. The only U.S. president to ever do this. After this, in 1951, the 22nd Amendment is enacted that says that presidents can only serve or be elected to 2 terms. And in the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, over 100,000 Japanese people were killed in the bombings, vaporized, burned to death. Thousands more will die of radiation sickness and of cancers and diseases caused by radiation, which we didn't fully understand how dangerous radiation was until the 1950s. In recent years, scholars and politicians have debated the morality of the dropping of the atomic bombs because of the high civilian casualties that came from these attacks, and then the diseases that people died from later because of the radiation. At the time, American military leaders, not all, but many of them, justified the bombings, arguing that they would actually save lives, that more people would be killed in a ground invasion than would be killed by the bombs. Um, it is true that over 100,000 people were killed in these atomic bombings, but even more people have been killed in the strategic bombings, the fire bombings of cities like Tokyo. It was thought that at least 1 million Japanese people, possibly multiple millions, would die in a conventional invasion, and then at least 1 million American troops would die, more than died in the entire rest of the war. But there's different statistics depending on who you cite. Some people argued that it was wrong, morally wrong, for America to use these bombs. That was what Oppenheimer argued, and Dwight Eisenhower actually made a similar argument. He said that he did not want to see America be the first country to use these bombs in warfare. And up to this point, America was and is the only country that has used nuclear weapons in warfare. Other countries have them and have tested them, but only we have actually used them in combat. And I think there is that myth of Japanese invincibility as well, that the Japanese would fight for months and months, that at least 1 million people would die. Japan was in a much more dire position, I think, than the Allies realized. Starvation, there was concern of mass uprisings, and even the Japanese government was much more divided. There were those that wanted to continue the war, and then there were the peace faction within the Japanese government. And Emperor Hirohito here actually exercised his power as emperor. He managed to convince enough of the military government to accept an unconditional surrender to the Allies. The only condition that they ended up actually getting was Hirohito was able to remain as emperor. But the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of the war in the Pacific, it will remain a controversial topic for many years in the future. Here are images related to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first bomb was called Little Boy. It was dropped by a plane called the Enola Gay. It's a B-29 bomber. It's at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. And the plane that dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, that bomb was called Fat Man. It was a bit more round, hence its name. And it was actually dropped by a B-29 called Log Cabin. And Log Cabin actually is at the National Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. I definitely recommend going to see these aircraft if you ever get the chance. It's really something else to see. And it's a controversial subject. Well over 100,000 Japanese people, many of them civilians, were killed in these bombings. And if the bombings had not worked, if Japan had continued to fight, the United States does not have another bomb ready to go to drop again. It might have made the United States look weak, actually, but it was a bit of a gamble by the Truman administration, along with the ethical concerns of using this weapon, including against civilian people. And I should also add, too, that the Japanese people had been warned that utter destruction was coming. This was not a out-of-nowhere surprise type of thing. In the 1990s, though, specifically about 1995, to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the end of World War II, and to a certain degree to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the bombing of these cities, there was an exhibit that was created by the Smithsonian about the Enola Gay. And the exhibit initially was going to focus more on the Enola Gay as a plane, the technology that was used, and there wasn't going to be very much focus at all on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what this meant for the Japanese people living there. And there was a lot of controversy between veterans organizations and between Japanese American groups. Only a few years earlier, the U.S. government in the late 80s had authorized payouts to survivors of Japanese internment camps. But there was debate about whether it was appropriate to talk about the human toll that these bombings took, or if that was going to be a disrespectful thing for American veterans, many of whom by 1995 were in their 70s and 80s and beginning to pass away. So it was a controversial subject in the 1990s, and there's still considerable controversy about the bombings today. Traditionally, in my research and reading, more left-leaning individuals have condemned these bombings as being unnecessary, or as being a war crime against civilians, or as being done to keep the Soviets out of Japan, and that it was done for anti-communist reasons. But in recent years, I'm seeing more people on the right, especially the more insurgent right, also condemning the bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whereas more centrist sources and more traditionally conservative sources still tend to support the bombings, arguing that more people would have died had there been a ground invasion of Japan. But I'll leave it up to you, the viewer, to decide if this was the right call or not. On August 15th, 1945, the Japanese government sued for peace and accepted a nearly unconditional surrender, a surrender in which the emperor was allowed to remain in power, but there would be an occupation of Japan, a demilitarization of Japan, and Japanese military leaders would have to go on trial, international trials for war crimes. But the peace agreement was finished by September 2nd, and September 2nd is VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, although in Australia they actually celebrate on August the 15th when the negotiations began. But now we're going to turn our attention towards the war in Europe. And now we'll turn our attention towards the U.S. War effort in Europe. And to begin, we must remember that the United States took a Europe first strategy. This was done at the behest of our allies, most notably Great Britain and the Soviet Union. We were supposed to allocate 80 to 90% of our human and economic resources, including things like lend-lease aid, to our European allies. And this was done under the belief that Germany was the leader of the Axis powers, and that Germany, if Germany was defeated, Japan might then sue for an unconditional surrender and peace. And that wasn't exactly what happened. After Germany surrendered, Japan wanted peace, but they wanted a negotiated peace, not an unconditional peace. And that largely unconditional surrender is not going to be achieved from Japan until 3 months after the German surrender. Technically 4 months if you count the conclusion of negotiations in September of 1945. And the U.S. High Command had different ideas about the best way to defeat the Axis, specifically Germany, in Europe. Also, the British had their ideas of what was the best way to defeat the Axis, and the Soviets had their ideas of what was the best way to defeat the Axis. And both Britain and the Soviet Union, they want to defeat Germany, but they also are thinking about their own self-interest as well. Stalin wants to take pressure off of the Soviet Union. On the Eastern Front, there is horrific fighting between the Soviet military and between the Wehrmacht, the German, land army. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill wants to take pressure off of the Soviet Union, but he also wants to take pressure off of Britain, and to a lesser degree, he also wants to preserve British colonial and imperial power as well. That is a goal of his. And American military leaders, they toss around their own ideas. One idea early on that the United States had was Operation Sledgehammer, which would have been a amphibious invasion of France, similar to Operation Overlord that happened in 1944. But this plan didn't go anywhere because the British opposed it. The British wanted to focus on a invasion of North Africa, deployment in North Africa. And U.S. Leaders eventually realized that they did not have the resources and the experienced ground troops to attempt a operation in France. So in the end, we're going to go along with the British plan of a amphibious assault on North Africa, and that's called Operation Torch. The idea is there are oil fields in North Africa, which the Nazis desperately need. They desperately need oil to continue their campaign in Russia. There's also oil in Russia that the Nazis really need as well. And things in 1942 really don't look very good for the Allies in Europe. Germany has pushed the Soviet Union back deep into its own territory. The Nazis are about 50 miles from Moscow. They are besieging Leningrad or St. Petersburg. They are besieging Stalingrad as well in the southern part of the country. Things really don't look good. But the hope is that an attack on North Africa will deny the Germans the oil fields of North Africa. It will protect British territorial holdings in Egypt, and it can take some pressure off of the Soviets that the German military will have to withdraw troops from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Front and send them down to North Africa. And so Operation Torch is planned. And the United States will land troops at 3 locations in North Africa in November of 1942. And you're going to see that initially the Allies are going to struggle. They're going to struggle coordinating between the British, the Free French, and the U.S. troops. Not to mention, U.S. troops are relatively inexperienced compared to their British allies, and they're having a hard time as well early in this war identifying who their best officers are, their most aggressive and their most successful officers, men like George Patton and Omar Bradley, for example. And once the United States begins to coordinate better, things will improve. But there's going to be some really tough battles for the U.S. early on in the African campaign, particularly the Battle of Kasserine Pass, for example. But the combined pressure from the U.S. Coming out of the west and the British coming from the east, and then the Free French as well, it's going to basically crush the Axis forces, the German forces, the fascist Italian forces, and the Vichy France forces are going to be trapped between the Allies in North Africa. And the Allied successes in North Africa, the surrender of hundreds of thousands of Axis troops, combined with some changes in the Eastern Front in Russia, particularly at Stalingrad, this is going to be a turning point in the European War. So by May of 1943, things are going to begin to move in the direction of the Allies, in favor of the Allies. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he said that it's not the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning, the collapse of the Axis in Europe. And this is Africa, it's North Africa, but it's along the Mediterranean Sea. It's considered to be a part of the overall European theater, even though technically it is Africa. And there was also fighting in sub-Saharan Africa as well, particularly between the British and the Free French fighting against Italy. But the U.S. was not directly involved in the fighting in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a survey course, so I'm not going to go over that here. And here are some images related to the Operation Torch and the Allied operations in North Africa. The United States deployed at 3 locations in Africa. The Western Force landed in Morocco, the Central Force landed in Iran, and the Third Force landed at Algiers. And the United States fought against the Vichy French forces in that region. They put up some resistance, but they surrendered fairly quickly. And some of the French Vichy forces, particularly the French Foreign Legion, actually went over to the Allied side. And the United States was partnering with the British, led by Bernard Montgomery, General Montgomery, or Monty as he was called. They're fighting against the Vichy French, the fascist Italian forces, and against the German Afrika Korps, which was led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He was called the Desert Fox, and probably the most capable of all of the German army commanders. And at the Kasserine Pass, Allied forces were not able to coordinate well, and they were defeated by the Axis forces. But over time, the Allies, having more resources, they're able to fight the Axis forces and advance. The United States will advance from the west. The British will advance from the east and from Egypt. And they're essentially going to crush the Axis forces in a pincer movement, and hundreds of thousands of Axis troops, German and Italian and Vichy French, will surrender to the Allies. And this will set up for the invasion of Italy and Sicily. While the Western Allies are fighting the Axis in North Africa, the Soviets are fighting on the Eastern Front. And some of the most horrific fighting on the Eastern Front, and indeed in all of World War II, takes place in southern Russia in the Caucasus region near the town of Stalingrad. This fighting happens from July of 1942 to February of 1943. Using blitzkrieg tactics, the Germans had advanced deep into the region in the summer of 1942. Their plan was to capture the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus region. The Axis, especially Germany, desperately needs oil. And the Soviets are knocked back and are being pushed back. But as time goes on, they begin to counterattack. And essentially, the Germans go from besieging the city of Stalingrad to being trapped in and around the city. Another reason why this area was strategically significant was not only the oil fields, but the Volga River, which Stalingrad is built on, had become an important water transportation route for bringing lend-lease supplies up from the south, from the Persian region. It was called the Persian route for lend-lease aid. Cutting off lend-lease aid it was important in addition to capturing these oil fields. But it was horrific fighting, particularly in the winter. Even in southern Russia, it is still extremely cold, and casualty numbers are pretty rough, but we believe that well over a million Axis troops, not just Germans, but Italians, Romanians, and other Axis allied forces, and troops from occupied countries as well, were sent into the meat grinder that was the Eastern Front and Stalingrad. And the Soviets possibly lost over 2 million troops as well. And really, Stalingrad, by some estimates, if you look at it as a single battle, it's the worst battle in world history. But the Battle of Stalingrad ends with an Allied victory, or a Soviet victory, in February of 43, and then the Allies achieve victory in North Africa in May of 1943. So there's good reason that Churchill said it wasn't the beginning of the end, but it was the end of the beginning. Now that we've touched on North Africa and a little bit on the Eastern Front, we're going to talk more about the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Allied leaders, especially Prime Minister Churchill, believed that the Axis could be most easily defeated by pushing through fascist Italy. Churchill believed that Italy was the soft underbelly of the Axis in Europe, and that they could be easily defeated, and that could set up for a defeat of Germany. And again, Churchill is thinking about consolidating and protecting British territorial holdings in North Africa as well. That's also on his mind. And many American officers still prefer the idea of an invasion of northern France. The invasion of Italy will begin with Operation Husky in July of 1943, and this will be the invasion of Sicily. And the British plan was to push on to Messina, the capital of the Sicilian island. Sicily is part of Italy. And the U.S. would move along to the west and would essentially be a shield for the British. And while Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander, General Bernard Montgomery, or Monty as he was known, also had strong ambitions and ideas for how he wanted to fight in the war and in Sicily. And so there's tension between the Americans and the British in the invasion and capture of Sicily. But it will be a successful mission, and it will serve as a staging ground for the invasion of the Italian mainland, the boot of Italy. And the Allied success in Sicily, although there was tension between the British and the U.S., it's going to weaken the Italian resolve, particularly the Italian government's resolve. the King of Italy and the Italian government are going to remove Benito Mussolini from power on July 25th, 1943. He will um, have to flee Rome, and what will happen is he will set up what is called the Italian Social Republic, which is a sort of a fascist rump state that's going to be put together in northern Italy with some of the die-hard fascists that still support Mussolini. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany is supporting the Italian Social Republic, and they're going to fight against the Allies in the Italian mainland. The Allies will land troops on the Italian mainland in September in multiple operations, and the Italian government is actually going to capitulate shortly thereafter, except for the Italian Social Republic, which is still led by Mussolini way up north. And the Allies were right that the Italian government had been weak and that it did surrender, but it didn't mean that there wasn't going to be continued fighting, that the Nazis were not going to send troops down into Italy, and that there wouldn't be still a sort of lingering fascist resistance in the northern part of Italy. So there's going to be fierce fighting on the Italian peninsula in the fall and winter of 1943 and going into 1944. And you're especially going to see this in battles like the Battle of Monte Cassino, for example. And there's going to be fighting in Italy, in northern Italy especially, until 1945. It's not going to be that soft underbelly route into Germany. And by the way, Mussolini is eventually going to be assassinated by communist partisans, communist guerrillas in northern Italy. One of the reasons why the Allies struggle in Italy is the geography or the topography is very rocky and very mountainous in Italy, and it's not a good place to be on offense. Two, they're fighting the much more determined German army, the Wehrmacht. Three, not all of the Italian government capitulates. There is the Italian Social Republic under Mussolini. And then the final reason is the weather. In the Mediterranean, the rainy season is in the winter. It gets rainy, it gets snowy, there's too much cloud cover, and this makes air superiority much more difficult for the Allies. You need to have air superiority in order to win in World War II, and you especially need air superiority if you are on offense, as the Allies were in Italy. So by early 1944, the Allies again revisit the idea of invading France, as they had considered earlier in the conflict. Here is the invasion of Italy. As I said, the Italian government capitulated shortly after Allied troops deployed on the boot of Italy. But in Italy, it runs down the country, kind of like a zipper on a boot, are the Apennine Mountains. And Italy is a very rugged place, especially in and around Rome. And it's not a good place to be on offense. You're also fighting against the German army. The German soldiers were very tough, very well trained, and there are fascist elements in the Italian Social Republic as well. Italy does not end up being the soft underbelly that Churchill and the Allies hoped it would be. And of course, the fighting that's happening in the fall and winter of 43 and into 44, the weather is not conducive for Allied air superiority, making their invasion even more difficult. Meanwhile, there also are operations to liberate Greece, which was taken over by Nazi Germany as well. That was more a British operation, and the liberation of Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia was handled more by the Soviets. The United States was much more focused on Western Europe, so I'm going to focus primarily on Western Europe here. These are some of the new technologies that helped America and the Allies achieve air superiority over the skies of Europe. The British had made some important discoveries with radar technology, which will be used to detect Luftwaffe attacks, and then it can be used to send out RAF fighter sorties, and eventually the Americans will use radar technology as well, but it's a British technology first. That's why Stalin said it was British brains and American steel. Granted, there was a lot of American brains as well, particularly with the Manhattan Project. Here are some of the aircraft used by the United States. There's the P-51 Mustang, which could be outfitted with what were called drop tanks, extra gas tanks. These were used to give the Mustang a longer range so that it could escort um, Allied bombers, B-17s and B-24 bombers, these four-engine bombers here. It could escort them into German territory. These bombers don't have as long of a range as the B-29, but that's not as important in Western Europe, especially after the United States establishes air bases in France after Operation Overlord and the invasion of Normandy. But these technologies, they helped the United States achieve air superiority, and then other technologies like sonar, which are greatly improved during World War II, along with greater torpedo technologies. The Allies are also going to achieve naval superiority as well. And naval superiority actually is another reason why North Africa was important. The Allies need to be able to secure all of the Mediterranean coast. That way they could ship Lend-Lease supplies across the Mediterranean Sea and not have to worry about as many U-boat attacks. They need to be able to get across the Mediterranean to get supplies into the Soviet Union via the southern route, the Mediterranean and Black Sea route. And this is the toll of the strategic bombings that take place in the European theater in World War II. And the U.S. took a similar approach with the B-29s against Japan in the Pacific as well. But initially, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, they pushed for the bombing of German cities, and not just the bombing of factories and infrastructure, but of German housing and apartment complexes. Their plan literally was dehousing. Their goal was to demoralize the German people. That way they would sue for peace or even possibly rise up against Hitler. And the British, they had this idea because of the Battle of Britain and because of the Blitz. The German Luftwaffe had tried the same thing against the British people. So it's understandable that the British would want to do this right back to the Germans. In addition, the RAF did not have the resources that the U.S. Army Air Force had. They ran their bombing sorties at night, which is safer because it's lower visibility. The German flat guns and anti-aircraft guns, they have to use searchlights and things like that. But you can't be as precise in your bombing. Your bombardiers can't see the ground as well at night because these cities are blacked out during warfare. The United States, however, it will run its bombing missions during the day because we're trying to not maximize German casualties. We're trying to target their factories and target their infrastructure. As time goes on, though, these daytime bombings, which allow for more accuracy, we continue the daytime bombings, but we're going to come around to this dehousing strategy, and we're going to drop bombs on cities like Hamburg and Dresden, particularly the firebombing of Dresden. 25,000 plus German civilians will be killed in the bombing of Dresden. Essentially, the firebombing of Dresden, it created almost like fire tornadoes that were really hard to put out and led to thousands of Germans losing their lives and losing their homes. And similar things are done in Hamburg as well. And we were doing this in Tokyo and in Japanese cities as well. But this is total war. It's bringing the war to the civilian population, and aircraft play an essential role in total war and in the kind of warfare you see in World War II. And the Axis powers were attempting to do this against the Allies. And these are not the only attacks on civilians that take place during the war. There are attacks on civilians by the Japanese throughout the Pacific, and there are attacks on civilians by the Germans on the Eastern Front, attacks by the Russians against Germans on the Eastern Front, and of course there is the Holocaust as well. The Allies had achieved air superiority over the skies of Europe by 1944, and they had achieved naval superiority in the waters of the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean as well by 1944. And this is best seen in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic had been ongoing even before the U.S. officially entered World War II militarily. German U-boats were sinking ships carrying supplies. from Europe, or from America to Europe. And one of the main reasons that Nazi Germany declared war on the United States was so that there could be unrestricted submarine warfare against American vessels that were bringing essential supplies to the British and to the Soviet Union. It's a little bit of a replay of what happened in World War I. The Germans have to keep their enemies from getting supplies from the United States. And initially, things do not go well for the Allies, for the British, for the United States. We're losing a lot of ships. Tens of thousands of Allied sailors are going to be killed at sea. About 3,500 Allied ships are going to be sunk during the Battle of the Atlantic, and over 70,000 Allied sailors and merchantmen are going to be killed, compared to 30,000 Axis submariners and about 700 U-boats. And by 1942, the Western Allies, they gained the upper hand thanks to the interception and decoding of the Enigma cipher. Enigma was the cipher that was used to make code that allowed the German submarines to communicate, or the U-boats to communicate with the Kriegsmarine and Admiral Karl Donitz, who was in charge of the German Navy. And at first, the Allies used this technology to plot their convoys around where the U-boats are going to be active. And as time goes on, they're going to be able to be more aggressive, and they're eventually going to be able to start attacking and targeting the German U-boat wolf packs, they were called. And other important developments are the use of the convoy system, which was done during World War I. Convoys are slower, but they're much safer. Destroyers can protect the merchant vessels, and they can drop depth charges on the U-boats. Sonar technology also improved significantly during World War II, and it became much more usable and effective against U-boats, along with depth charge technology improving. In addition, air power was an essential part of the Allies' defeat of the Axis in the battle for the Atlantic. Escort carriers, like the one you see on this slide, were constructed. They could launch aircraft, they could patrol the skies and look for German U-boats. And this was also an essential part of defeating the Axis U-boats. In particular, the Allied aircraft would attack the Axis U-boats when they were resupplying. There were special resupply subs called milk cows. That was their nickname. And they would attack the milk cows that were bringing oil and other food and supplies and munitions for the attack submarines. And this was an opportunity to attack both the wolf packs and their supplies. And the Axis U-boat navy was largely defeated by 1944. There were still attacks after 1944, but this makes Operation Overlord possible, and it continues the flow of Lend-Lease supplies into Britain and into the Soviet Union. The Soviets received supplies via their Arctic ports at Archangel and Murmansk, and they also received supplies from the south via the Mediterranean as well, and the Black Sea. So the Germans were very skilled technologically. They were doing their own research on nuclear bombs. They lost some of their best scientists who fled the country, and they also lost a lot of progress due to espionage during the war, and sabotage as well. But they did have some important technological developments. Heavy railroad guns used on the Eastern Front, like the Gustav gun, that you can see at the bottom of this slide. The Germans also developed the Messerschmitt ME 262, which was a jet plane. The British also experimented with jets as well, but the ME 262, I've talked to engineers and even rocket scientists that I know and that I've come across in my work, and they said that it was nothing like what the Allies were working on. It was decades ahead of its time, and we actually took ME 262s that we captured during the war, and we tore them apart and used them to build our own jet aircraft. The Germans were also leaders in rocket technology, in the V1 and V2 rockets. The V1 rocket was more like a cruise missile, but the V2 rocket is going to be expanded and further improved to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles that are used in the 1950s. And eventually, the technology is going to be used in the space programs, both of the U.S. and of the Soviet Union. So they were leaders in certain technologies. The thing about German military technology and military production and industrial production was it was very uneven, and this was due to several reasons. It was due to resource shortages, especially oil. The Germans in World War I, they're bound by their geography. They're bound by their geography in World War II as well. They don't have access to the oil that the Russians have. They don't have access to the oil that Americans have. And that's going to be a major problem in a blitzkrieg total war where you need oil for your aircraft and oil for your tanks. So they're going to experiment with things like rockets instead. These are what we would call prestige objectives. They're objectives that intimidate the enemy, and they are inspiring for your own forces and your own people, but they really aren't enough to win a war. There were other problems just with aircraft manufacturing as well. The Nazis were not making nearly enough aircraft until too late in the war. They actually hit their peak in aircraft production in 1944, but by then it was too late. By then, Allied bombers were getting deeper into German territory, and they were really starting to target German factories. Albert Speer, who was chief of the air production in Germany, was always telling Hitler, we need to produce more aircraft. We need to produce more aircraft. But Hitler did not want to do that. He wanted to focus on other technologies. And also Hitler did not want to make it seem like the German people were losing the war. He thought that they would get that idea if factories started making more aircraft and less civilian consumer goods. So the German economy was not nearly as well mobilized as it could have been. That will also contribute to their defeat, combined with resource shortages and command mistakes by Hitler and by other German officers. Here are some images of tanks from World War II, and these images are illustrative of the Allied, specifically the US and the German grand strategies. On the right-hand side of the slide is the German Tiger II. The image was taken in France in 1944. The Tiger II was one of the best, most sophisticated, most powerful of all of the German tanks, or panzers as they were called. And on the left-hand side is the Sherman M4 medium tank, one of the most common American tanks that was built in the war. And there's some stats about these tanks that are useful and I think are indicative of their grand strategies. So the Sherman tank had a 400 horsepower Ford engine, and it weighed about 30 tons, and it had decent armor and artillery guns, but it wasn't as well armored or as well sloped either as the Tiger was. And sloping of armor is important because it helps to better deflect artillery shots and shrapnel and things like that to protect the crew of the tank inside. The Tiger was a much heavier tank. It was 70 tons. It also had a 750 horsepower Maybach engine, so a much more powerful engine as well. Really, tank for tank, a much more capable weapon. It also had a longer gun, giving it a longer range as well. The thing is, in a one-on-one tank battle between a Tiger II and a Sherman, if everything else is equal, the Tiger is most likely going to win unless there's serious operator error from the Tiger tank commander. But the thing is, the Axis, the Nazis in particular, they don't make nearly as many tanks as even the U.S. alone. The U.S. alone makes about 60,000 tanks during the war, many of which are going to be shipped to Britain and shipped to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease. The Nazis, they make perhaps 20,000 tanks. They make far fewer of them, even if their individual tanks are better. And tanks, remember, are best used when they're deployed together, essentially in swarms, rather than spread out across the entire troops advance. So more tanks, even if is better, even if they're not quite as capable or powerful. I should also add too that the Tiger II tank, yes, it does have a more powerful engine at 750 horsepower, but it's more than double the weight of the Sherman tank. So in some ways, it's actually a little bit underpowered. But it's a highlight of the German approach to industry and to construction, of excellence and prestige objectives, but not building enough of what they need to win the war. And the United States builds enough to make its own war effort work. The image on the left-hand side of the Sherman is actually from the invasion of Normandy and of northern France. The Sherman could be easily customized and outfitted with devices to detonate mines or to cut through hedgerows. Hedgerows were a big obstacle in northern France. And in terms of maintenance, the Sherman was much easier to work on compared to the Tiger. They used to say for the Tiger, for every 1 hour of combat that it would go through, it would need 10 hours of maintenance. And for the Sherman, they would say that for every 10 hours of combat, it only needed 1 hour of maintenance. So it's a much more reliable piece of equipment. And you see Sherman tanks with the U.S. military, with the U.S. Army. You also see them being used by the British, and you see them being used by the Soviets on the Eastern Front as well. So the United States is making more than enough tanks for itself and for its allies. So now we'll talk about the invasion of Normandy, or Operation Overlord. The United States had tossed around the idea of invading Normandy much earlier in the war, Operation Sledgehammer, but the stalling of the advance in Italy, combined with pressure from the Soviet Union, pressure from Stalin, led the United States and the British to consider a new amphibious assault on northern France. Some U.S. military personnel, particularly those that were with the Army Air Force, they really hoped that we might not even need to invade Germany. They thought that perhaps strategic bombing of Germany, destruction of German cities and factories, combined with, you would say, the invasion from the east of the Soviets, it might make an invasion of Germany unnecessary. But that wasn't what ended up happening. And Stalin really wanted the United States and Britain to open another front in northern France. And there was good reason to be optimistic about an invasion of northern France. The geography is much flatter. You don't have the rugged mountains and valleys the way you do in Italy. You do have these hedgerows. They're very thick, but they're not nearly as difficult of an obstacle to overcome as what is in Italy. And the United States is gaining air superiority along with the British. The Allies are gaining air superiority in Western Europe. The development of radar plays a major role in that. P-51 Mustang fighters that have longer range play a role in that. So we are able to see what the Luftwaffe is up to, and we're able to defeat any missions from the Luftwaffe. We're also able to provide coverage for our own advances as well. So we're ready for an assault on northern France. In addition, the battle for the Atlantic Ocean, for naval superiority, by 1944 it has been won as well. German U-boats have not been completely defeated, but they've really been knocked back by the U.S. Navy and by the British Navy. New technologies have been developed, new strategies have been developed, and we now can attempt an assault across the English Channel and not have to worry about German U-boats attacking our troop ships and our transports. And that's where sonar becomes important, where depth charges become important. And we will also begin to intercept German U-boat communications, and we're going to break the German secret codes, the Enigma codes. And Operation Overlord, the D-Day of Operation Overlord was on June 6, 1944. When people study World War II and they say D-Day, they're usually referencing Operation Overlord, but D-Day is technically a term for the first day of any major mission. There's many D-Days in World War II history, but the most famous D-Day was June 6th, 1944, in which the American, British, and Canadian troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. We encountered stiff German resistance, particularly at Omaha Beach. There were some topographical challenges at the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, but there was less resistance around Pointe du Hoc. That was at Utah Beach. and we will establish a secure beachhead. And meanwhile, we had been bombing German positions to the rear, taking out bridges, taking out communication networks, and we dropped paratroopers from the 101st Airborne behind behind German lines to disrupt their communications. So what happened was Hitler and the Nazis erroneously believed that the Allies would attack further to the east near Calais, which is kind of close to Dunkirk and where the British had fled from France back in 1940. They'd been basically tricked with a feint, and then we ended up attacking much further to the west at Normandy via these amphibious assaults. So the Germans weren't expecting this assault at this location until too late, and then their communications have been disrupted by our paratroopers and by our bombing runs. And there's hard fighting for 2 months after June of 1944, but we do eventually liberate Paris by the end of August 1944. Here is Supreme Allied Commander and future U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower addressing the 101st Airborne. Eisenhower was very nervous going into Operation Overlord. He was concerned that our casualty rates on D-Day would be very high, unacceptably high. He thought there might be as many as 20,000 casualties. The casualties ended up being quite a bit lower. They were close to 10,000, but it was still really horrific, particularly at Omaha Beach. But the troops of the 101st Airborne, they were courageous. They said, "General, don't worry about it. Give us a chance. We're going to do what we need to do behind enemy lines." And I think that overall Eisenhower was a very good, very decent, very moderate man who really cared about the lives of his troops, in addition to being a very good tactician as well. And by the way, there were between 4,000 and 9,000 Axis casualties during Operation Overlord and the amphibious assault on the beaches of Normandy. Here are some images related to Operation Overlord and then the subsequent U.S. and Allied maneuvers in northern France. The U.S. landed at Omaha and Utah Beach, and the British and Canadian forces, they landed at Gold, Sword, and Juno Beach. And there was very, very hard fighting for the United States at Omaha Beach. You get a taste of what that fight was like in the movie Saving Private Ryan, which is actually a more accurate film than you might think when it comes to World War II history. Certainly it's more accurate than films that came out right after the war, like The Longest Day, for example. Technically, The Longest Day came out in 62, so it was 18 years after the operations of Operation Overlord. But this image here is of the hedgerows that grow in northern France. They're used to divide up fields and land, and they're actually a pretty formidable obstacle. The Germans could hide machine gun nests and even artillery or even tanks, panzers inside these hedgerows. So it'll be rough going breaking through the hedgerows and capturing the towns of northern France. But by August of 1944, the United States will liberate the city of Paris and will be welcomed and celebrated by the people of France. We were also partnering with the French resistance during our maneuvers in France as well, and the French were eager to celebrate the arrival of the U.S. liberators, but on a more negative side, once the Allies were in control, the French citizenry also began to punish collaborators, men and women who had supported the Nazis during the occupation of their own country. And it's understandable that they were angry, but young women who had had relationships and even children with the Germans, they were treated very badly. They were attacked and stripped of their clothing. In some cases, their heads were shaved and they were dragged to the streets and publicly shamed for having had what was called horizontal collaboration with the enemy. The idea in this patriarchal system was that these women had betrayed not only themselves and their communities, but their country by doing what they had done with German soldiers, and men who collaborated with the Axis would be killed. So you do see this as well in the Allied liberation of France. The Allies will attempt to move quickly into Germany via the Netherlands. Um, this is called Operation Market Garden. It was primarily the brainchild of Bernard Montgomery, the British commander who, one, he wants to end the war early, but two, he has his own ambitions and he wants to be the hero who ends the war early. And the idea is it's blitzkrieg, basically. We're going to move very quickly. We're going to capture key bridges in the Netherlands, and then we're going to move our tanks and our trucks and our infantry up along these bridges. But in order to be successful, not only do we have to liberate the Netherlands, but we've got to capture all three of these bridges. The bridge over the Meuse River, the bridge over the Wall, and then the bridge over the Rhine, which crossed the Rhine at Arnhem, which you can see on the image of this slide. And it was meant to be a joint operation between U.S. and British paratroopers who would move in advance and then be backed up by ground troops, infantry, and tanks. This operation, though, is a failure because there was not proper communication between the British and the American forces and between the paratroopers and the infantry. And the Allies encountered much stiffer resistance in the Netherlands than they expected, particularly from German panzers. And this was disappointing for the Allies, who hoped to use this easy route into Germany. Essentially, it's kind of a reverse of the Schlieffen Plan that the Germans used in World War I to get quickly into France. Instead, we're going to have to move more slowly. We're going to have to move through the Ardennes forest, and we're going to have to attack along what is called the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was a very fortified set of German forts and pillboxes and fortifications, kind of like the French Maginot Line. And so we're going to attack at the German city of Aachen and in the Ruhr Valley. But some people think that if Market Garden had been successful, then World War II might have ended, or the war in Europe might have ended by Christmas of 1944. The thing is, though, it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory for Germany. Germany may have beaten back the Allied advance in the Netherlands, but they use a lot of resources to do this, and they use a lot of tanks as well, or panzers. Tanks and panzers that they are going to have a very difficult time replacing. The Germans had significant problems with fuel, significant industrial problems, producing enough trucks, producing enough tanks. The German military, even though they had excellent tanks, the Tigers, they had resource shortages. They're still using a lot of horse-drawn carts and things like that to move supplies just because of supply and industrial problems. On the left side of this slide are scenes from Operation Market Garden, and on the right is a battle map of the actual operation of Market Garden. You can see here U.S. Airborne troops, the 101st and the 82nd. They're going to move towards Arnhem on the Rhine River. You've got to secure this river head, this bridge head, if you're then going to move into Germany. That's not what happens. They are not able to hang on to the bridge over Arnhem, and essentially because they don't get all three of the bridges, Market Garden is a failure. They may have liberated most of the Netherlands, which is great for the Dutch people. The Dutch were persecuted by the Germans during World War II, and Frank, a Jewish girl, was persecuted by the Germans. Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch Christian woman who hid Jews, was persecuted. Frank was killed. Corrie ten Boom was sent to a concentration camp. She survived, but her sister died in the camp. But it's good for the Dutch people that many of them were liberated, but at the same time, they aren't able to get all three of the bridges. So tactically speaking, this was a failure for the United States and for the Allies. Instead, they're going to have to attack through the the Ardennes Forest and through the heavily fortified Siegfried Line. Also, the Ruhr Valley here is an area that is difficult to move through. It's got heavy forests, and there also are some dams in the Ruhr Valley, which the Allies will need to capture those dams, because if they don't capture the dams, the Germans can destroy the dams and potentially flood out the Allies. This is the U.S. fighting and capture of Aachen or Aachen. This happens in the fall of 1944. The city is captured. It is a Allied victory, but it comes at a great loss, and the Germans fight very aggressively in this city. This was the capital city of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. It's the seat of the First Reich. So not only is this city tactically and strategically significant, it is spiritually and culturally significant for the Germans as well. So they're going to fight very aggressively to hang on to the city. But this is going to slow down the Allied advance in the fall of 1944. The fighting at Hurtgen Forest in the fall and winter of 44 goes even worse for the Allies. The weather is not cooperative as we're going into winter. The Germans are very dug in the Ruhr Valley, and the United States and the Western Allies, they need to capture certain dams and infrastructure in the Ruhr Valley region to prevent the Axis, the Nazis, from blowing them up and flooding out the Allied advance. But in the end, the Allies are not going to capture the dams until February of 1945. So this was a battle that went even worse for the Allies in late 1944. The Allies' slow progress at Market Garden, at Aachen, and in the Ruhr Valley convinced the German high command, especially Hitler, that a counterattack on the Western Allies could be a good idea. It could demoralize the Western Allies, it could push them back, and it could lead to the Western Allies possibly even suing for peace with Germany. And then Hitler and the Nazis could focus all of their effort on the Eastern Front and on fighting the Soviet Union. Hitler had even though he hated Russians and hated communism, he thought that Russian soldiers were tougher and better than American soldiers. And he thought this not without reason. American troops, by the fall of 1944, a lot of the best American troops, the smartest, the most experienced, a lot of them had either been killed or wounded. And the U.S. Army was beginning to draw in a lot more younger recruits, 18, 19, 20-year-old men, as opposed to some of the older, more experienced troops who had either been killed or wounded. Also, this is a problem throughout the U.S. war effort in the Europe as well as in the Pacific. But we had things like IQ tests and aptitude tests that determined what position in the military you took. And generally speaking, we put the lowest scoring people, you might say the least intelligent people, into the infantry. And the idea was more technical positions and positions in the rear with the gear. We're going to give those to smarter people. That way they will be kept alive, and they're the ones making the big decisions. They ought to be the smartest, most capable people. And I get that reasoning, but the problem is you do need to have smart, really quick-thinking people in the infantry, particularly to become your NCOs, your non-commissioned officers. So there's going to be a big problem with this in Europe, and what you're going to see is that the Wehrmacht, for every one Wehrmacht soldier that's going to be killed by the Allies, 1.7 Allied troops, especially U.S. troops, are going to be killed. So on the whole, though, it's better to be a soldier in Europe than it is to be in the Pacific. The death rate for American troops and the casualty rate for American troops is still better in Europe. I've estimated that it was about 1 in 16% American soldiers would become a casualty, killed, wounded, or captured in Europe, versus between 1 in 7 and 1 in 5 in the Pacific. But anyway, this thinking leads to a German counterattack in December of 1944, and this is known as the Battle of the Bulge here in the United States. So, as was the case in the winter of 43 and 44 in Italy, winter snowstorms negated Allied air superiority. It allows the Germans to move without being seen from enemy aircraft, and they can screen their advances and they can begin to attack U.S. troops in the Ardennes forest who are resting and resupplying and getting ready for the fighting in 1945. And initially, the Wehrmacht is very successful. They cut off American troops at towns like Bastogne and surround isolated troops like the 101st Airborne, and they're pushing all the way on towards Antwerp, the important Belgian port city. Essentially, they're trying to divide the Allied army in half, essentially, between the Ardennes forest and between Antwerp. And Eisenhower and the Allied command are knocked onto their back feet. The troops, especially the American troops, have supply issues, and it really is a pretty dire situation for the Allies. Their morale is falling very quickly as the Germans are advancing into their territory. And General Patton of the Third Army had an idea, though. Instead of trying to meet the German advance head on and stop the bleeding, Patton proposed, let's go in from the south, let's cut off the Germans, and by doing so, we can then liberate American troops that have been surrounded by the Germans, these pockets of American and Allied resistance. The image you see here on this slide is General Patton giving a medal to General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne. He was surrounded by the Germans at Bastogne. He was urged to surrender by the Germans. He famously said, "Nuts." He and his troops refused to surrender, and they were eventually liberated by the Third Army. Here is General Patton, and here is in green is the German advance in the Battle of the Bulge through the Ardennes forest. And Patton's proposal was to cut in from the south and basically cut off the German advance and liberate Americans that had fallen behind enemy lines. And it was really, really harsh fighting in the winter of 44 and 45. The U.S. troops had not been well outfitted for the cold, for the winter weather. Supply issues were a major problem. Not a shortage of supplies, but just getting the supplies logistically to where they needed to be. The German troops were better prepared for the winter conditions than the Western Allies, especially the U.S. were. In the end, though, the Battle of the Bulge ends up being a failure for Hitler and the Nazis. They don't stop the Western advance. They use scarce resources and oil especially, and the Allies just continue to advance deeper into German territory going into 1945. In 1945, the full-scale Allied advance into Germany will continue. We are going to advance from the west into Germany. At the same time, American and French and Soviet troops are also advancing from the south and from the east. Particularly the Soviets are advancing from the east. And as we advance deeper into German territory, we begin to discover the atrocities that Hitler and the Nazis had perpetrated against the Jews and other ethnic groups in the Third Reich. We begin to find and liberate concentration camps in which people had been murdered en masse. And we had seen these concentration camps from the air, but it's one thing to see something from the air and not fully understand what's going on. It's another thing to actually see it on the ground, to see the bodies of the dead, to see mass graves, to see crematoria, and to see the survivors, the emaciated and sick and dying survivors that were in these camps. It's estimated that over 13 million people were killed by the Nazis in these camps, including disabled people, homosexuals, Jews, at least 6 million Jews, along with other ethnic groups that Hitler deemed to be inferior to the Aryan Germans, including Poles, Roma. They're often known as gypsies, although some people think of that as a slur term, but not as many people know the term Roma. And then Russians who were killed by the Germans as well. not only through these murders, but through starvation and other policies enacted by the Nazis. And within the Holocaust, at least 6 million Jews were killed, about two-thirds of the European Jewish population. And the injustices of the Holocaust angered many Americans who condemned the Nazis for these genocidal acts. Um, Even as many Americans will continue to dismiss certain injustices that are taking place in the United States. People would view what was happening in the South, for example, or domestic anti-Semitism as being minor and trivial in comparison to the mass extermination that you're seeing committed by the Nazis. Here are scenes from the liberation of the concentration camps at Dachau and Buchenwald. Um, these camps were liberated by American troops, and at Dachau in particular, they were so angered and so incensed by what they saw that they executed on the spot some of the camp guards they found. And it's easy to see why they would do such a thing. Still, though, I would say on the whole, the Allies treated their prisoners of war far better than the Axis did. The Germans pretended to follow the principles of the Geneva Convention with their POWs, and the Japanese made no attempt to follow those principles. There were reports of Americans not executing prisoners of war and things like that, but it was much rarer amongst the United States than it was amongst the Germans or amongst the Japanese or amongst our own allies, the Soviets. While the fighting is ongoing in Europe and still going on in the Pacific as well, the big three meet in Crimea in the Soviet Union to discuss the future governance of post-war Europe. And the Yalta Conference takes place before the Potsdam Conference. Um, but the Yalta Conference, in some ways, is seen as being a more significant conference than Potsdam was. And at this conference, FDR is still alive. He met with Stalin and Churchill, and FDR's conduct has been criticized at the Yalta Conference. It was argued that he was too magnanimous with Stalin, that decisions that he made at the Yalta Conference allowed Stalin to set up the Eastern Bloc in violation of previous agreements that had been made for self-determination of the Eastern and Central European countries that had been liberated. And that basically he had been too magnanimous to Stalin, and that enabled Stalin. And because of that, Harry Truman, the successor of FDR, had to take a tougher line with Stalin. And in addition, the Soviet Union still was slow to enter the war in the Pacific. Um, the U.S. had tried to get the Soviets to enter the war earlier in the Pacific, but they ended up not entering until 3 months after the fall of Germany. They will enter in August of 1945. And some who are more charitable to FDR, and I'm inclined to agree with them, they have suggested FDR's failing health may have played into some of the policy failures of the Yalta Conference. That had FDR been healthier and more strong physically, he might have drawn a harder line with Stalin. He might have gotten better concessions and agreements out of the Soviet dictator. Others who are more against FDR, who I think also make a pretty good point as well, is that across the war, FDR had been quite friendly with Stalin, and FDR would have said that he felt like he had to do this in order to keep Stalin in line and keep him as an ally. But many historians say that Churchill had a better understanding of Joseph Stalin as a dictator, and that FDR's successor, Harry Truman, had a better understanding of Stalin as a dictator as well. But this is a controversial subject, so I'll leave this up to viewers to make up their own mind. In the spring of 1945, the Western Allies, moving from the south and the west, and the Soviets moving from the east, begin to encircle Berlin. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower believed that allowing the Soviets to capture Berlin, he believed that this would be a prestige objective for the Soviets, and it would make them feel like the Western Allies trusted them and wanted to work with them. It would be a gesture of goodwill, you might say. And this was important because relations with the East and the West were already becoming strained, and the war is not even over yet. And we want to make sure that the Soviets will support the U.S. And Allied war effort in the Pacific as well against Japan. So after brutal street-to-street fighting and the German people being armed, the elderly, even the children being armed, Germany will surrender. Hitler will commit suicide on April 30th, and the German government will surrender by May 8th, 1945, which is VE Day. And the war will continue in the Pacific until August, but VE Day is May 8th, 1945. This is a map of the Allied advance into Germany and around Berlin in the spring of 1945. The Western Allies had the resources to capture Berlin, but the decision was to allow the Soviets to capture the capital of the Third Reich as a gesture of goodwill, as a prestige objective for the Germans and for the Russians against the Germans. And it was really, really awful street-to-street fighting, and in many cases there were acts of violence and what you might call war crimes against German civilians being committed by the Russians, particularly, unfortunately, against German women. The Soviets wanted revenge for the killing of Russian civilians, and I'm not saying it was right at all for the Soviets to do this sort of thing, but it did take place, and you have to imagine the anger that the Russians felt at the millions of Russians that had been killed, including civilians that had been killed by the Nazis, and not just the starvation, but really the intentional murder of the people of Eastern Europe. And while the Soviet capture of Berlin and of Eastern Germany was a gesture of goodwill to the Soviets, it will set the East and the West up for future conflict after World War II comes to an end. Before we wrap up this video, I want to talk about individual American military personnel that fought in Europe against the Germans. Similar to what I did when I talked about the Pacific War and American soldiers and Marines against Japanese troops. You'll remember from earlier in this video I said that the Germans killed significantly more of their enemies than they lost themselves. We think for every one German soldier that was killed on the Western Front, 1.7 Allied troops were killed, and the number is more significant on the Eastern Front. For every German soldier that was killed, we think as many as 2 Russian Red Army troops were killed. Compare this with the Pacific, where for every 1 American soldier that was killed, there were about 5 Japanese who would die. Even though the chance of becoming a casualty if you were an American soldier or Marine deployed to the Pacific, it was far more dangerous for you. It was just the Japanese were scoring those casualties while also losing a lot more of their own troops, and this was due to supply issues as well as Japanese cultural tactics and grand strategy issues. So in some ways, looking just at the soldier level, the individual warfighter level, the Germans really had the best troops of any side in World War II, even if they certainly don't have the best leadership either in moral terms or in grand strategic terms. Things like the Battle of the Bulge, for example, Operation Barbarossa, major strategic mistakes made by Hitler and the German High Command. So what made the individual German troops so good? Because they were losing a lot of their best troops, especially on the Eastern Front. Well, we have to look at the Wehrmacht in more detail. And technically, the Wehrmacht is the entire German military, the army, the Heer, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and the Kriegsmarine, the Navy. But we often use the term Wehrmacht as sort of a catch-all for German German soldiers that are not in the Waffen SS. The SS was a paramilitary organization that was considered to be the elite of the German military. They had paramilitary troops that were involved in things like the Holocaust and the concentration camps. Then you had the Waffen SS, which was more combat focused. And individual German troops, while the majority were conscripts or draftees, the Nazi ideology was still a motivating factor for the average German soldier in the army or the Heer. For the Waffen SS, though, Nazi ideology was a much more significant factor in motivation for service. The Waffen SS was an all-volunteer force. There were tougher requirements to get in, you had to prove that you were a true Aryan German, and you were tested on your Nazi ideology as well. So you have the German soldiers in the Heer, in the army, who are often referred to as the Wehrmacht, and then you have the ultra-ideological Waffen-SS, who are also fighting in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. And American troops were patriotic, but studies done on American soldiers after World War II found that while Americans did love their country, it was often unclear specifically why they were fighting to them. They knew that their country had been attacked and had been in danger, but they often found that American troops were less ideologically motivated than their Axis opponents. And this is comparing the ideological motivations of American soldiers in 20th century conflicts like World War II and like the later Vietnam War, actually comparing them to earlier conflicts like the American Civil War, where Americans in the Union and the Confederate armies were very ideological. So ideology, I think, might be a factor in why the Germans are able to score so many casualties. There are other what you might think of as more pedestrian reasons. The Germans are on defense in Western Europe by the time the Americans are deployed in large numbers. They're falling back through northern France and then through the western parts of Germany. They do counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge, but generally they're retreating, which defense is easier than offense in warfare, generally. Equipment was also a factor. German ground troops, whether they were in the Waffen SS or in the Heer, commonly referred to as the Wehrmacht, they used a variety of weapons, whether it was the bolt-action Kar-98K, very powerful machine guns like the MG42. You can see a picture of a soldier, I believe he's an SS soldier based on his uniform. Had a very high rate of fire, but it was hard to get enough ammunition. The Germans even experimented with what we would call early assault rifles, the Sturmgewehr. So they would issue out firearms to soldiers based on their tactical needs, which is tactically very efficient, but logistically can be very, very challenging. The United States, however, did not have as much variety in the small arms they issued. They would issue out M1 Garands or the M1A1 carbine, which you see an American infantryman holding on this slide. The carbine was reserved more for paratroopers because it was a lighter weapon and easier to handle, whereas the M1 Garand was a heavier caliber. And another issue that really caused the United States to struggle was they had a hard time finding good NCOs in World War II, especially in Europe. The Germans didn't have nearly the problem having good NCOs. So better small unit leadership, better weapons deployment, even if logistically there were challenges with deploying those types of weapons, fighting a defensive war, and ideology to a certain degree, I think, play into why the Germans, even as they were losing the war, were still able to score more casualties on their opponents, both in the Eastern Front against the Russian Red Army and in the West as well against the United States and the Western Allies. But now we're going to begin to come to our conclusion of this video. And here are some images associated with the end of World War II and the celebrations and the exuberance within the United States about news of the end of the war. And the center image is an iconic photograph from World War II and from the end of the conflict. There's a couple of versions of the photo. This is the photo that was taken by U.S. Navy photojournalist Victor Jorgensen. It's sometimes called Unconditional Surrender or the Kiss on VJ Day. There is some history behind this photograph. It's very interesting. There's many men and women who've claimed to be the subjects of this photo. We believe this photo specifically was of a young woman named Greta Zimmer Friedman. She actually was not a nurse. She was a dental hygienist, contrary to popular memory of the image. And the man, the sailor that is kissing her, many men have claimed to be him, but we believe that in this case it was a guy named George Mendonça. And we believe that he was intoxicated when he kissed her. The people around don't seem to be upset. Perhaps they assumed that these two knew each other. And I think a lot of people, when they first saw the photo, they assumed that this was a young couple, but these were actually two strangers that didn't know each other. And as I said, we think that this image was of Greta Friedman and George Mendonça, and she was actually interviewed by the Library of Congress in the 1980s about this moment, and she said that the kiss was not romantic, and that doesn't sound very good to our modern ears. This sounds like SA. I will say, though, that in the period's vernacular, if you've studied the language of the World War II years, and just differing ideas about gender relations as well, ideas that I'm not necessarily endorsing here at all, but to say something was not romantic is more a way of saying it's not sexual. She said that, it wasn't romantic, so it wasn't something that she enjoyed, but that it wasn't an act of SA. And I say SA because I'm not sure if I can use what SA stands for as a term on YouTube. And they asked Mendonça about this. Why did he do this? He didn't know this woman. He said that he was just so happy and relieved that the war was over and that he didn't really mean anything sexual by it. It's still not an appropriate thing to do. He didn't know her. You're violating somebody else's personal space. But to refer to it as an act of SA in the 21st century sense may not be the most, it may be a bit anachronistic. And I'm not saying that this was the right thing, or that if I were that sailor, that I would have done this sort of thing. But in recent years, this image has come to be more controversial. There are statues of this scene in several American cities, and some of them have been like vandalized. There was one in Sarasota, Florida, that was actually tagged with the words #MeToo several years ago in reference to the Me Too movement. Wrapping up our discussion of America in the Second World War, I'll begin by saying World War II had a tremendous impact on American society and world affairs. The conflict ramped up American industrial and economic output, making military production the cornerstone of the American economy, and galvanizing the American people against external foes, the Axis powers. American scientists had developed new technologies, including nuclear weapons, which would forever change how nations made war. And the U.S. mainland was not invaded or occupied. Um, the Philippines, which were a territory, they were invaded and occupied, and the Aleutian Islands were invaded and occupied, but not the U.S. 48 states. And American manufacturing centers and major cities were not destroyed. There were not mass civilian casualties in the war either. And we did have 400,000 American military personnel and others being killed or wounded during the war. But this is a much lower casualty rate out of the 70 million plus casualties experienced by all nations involved. America, in many ways, emerges not unscathed, but far less damaged by the war, and in some ways strengthened by this war. The war will greatly weaken the British and French empires. Even though Britain and France were on the winning side in this war, they're going to be greatly weakened by this conflict, and their empires are going to collapse in the years following the war. And Germany will have to be rebuilt. Japan will have to be rebuilt. Italy will have to be rebuilt as well. And America and the Soviet Union will be the two emerging superpowers after World War II. And as time goes on, they will be superpowers that are opposed to each other. And the U.S. and the USSR had been adversaries since the nation became communist during and after World War I. But we had become allies temporarily against Germany and Japan and against the Axis. But with the defeat of the Axis, relations between the U.S. and the USSR are going to deteriorate very quickly, leading to the beginning of the Cold War between these two superpowers, which we'll talk about in future videos.